Hi, and welcome to That's Ready Mysterious. Join me for an intriguing look into real-life mysteries. Who was the mad gasser of Mattoon? What was whaling at the Wilga waterhole? I'm not going to solve those mysteries, but they'll be interesting to learn about. I'm your host, Kelly with an I. Transcripts and references for all episodes can be found at that'sreadymysterious.wordpress.com. No apostrophe and no exclamation point. Today's tale is about the princes in the tower. Historian and chief curator of historic royal palaces, Tracy Borman, said, "The fate of the princes in the tower is one of the most intriguing mysteries in the long history of this iconic fortress and palace." She went on to say, "It continues to fascinate visitors today, more than 500 years after the princes disappeared." The princes, Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York, were the sons of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. They were born during the War of the Roses. The War of the Roses lasted from 1455 to 1485. It was a series of civil wars between two rival branches of the Plantagenet family, who were fighting over the throne of England. The Red Rose was the House of Lancaster, led by King Henry VI. The White Rose was the House of York, led by Henry's cousin, King Edward IV. Both Henry VI and Edward IV were descendants of Edward III, and there had been previous fights over the throne. In 1461, Edward IV imprisoned Henry VI in the Tower of London and took the crown. The first years of Edward IV's rule were marked by violence. The new king was usually away fighting to defend his throne. Sometime in the spring or summer of 1464, Edward IV married the widow Elizabeth Woodville. Their marriage was announced in September of that year, and it received a bad reception at court. She was not considered to be a good match for a king. Although Elizabeth came from a respected family, they lacked titles or diplomatic allies, and the Woodvilles were Lancastrian supporters. That included Elizabeth's late husband, who had died for the Lancaster family. In 1470, Henry VI's Lancastrian supporters managed to free him from the Tower of London and had him recrowned. The event was known as the Readoption. Edward IV, along with his wife, their children, and their brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, ran away to Flanders. They asked to seek refuge in St. Peter's Sanctuary, which is inside Westminster Abbey. On October 1st, 1470, a pregnant Elizabeth made it to the Abbey alongside her mother and 3 daughters. 1 month later, Elizabeth gave birth to Edward, who became heir to the throne. Henry VI's reign was cut short in 1471 when Edward returned from exile. Edward's followers defeated Henry's followers at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Henry's heir was killed in the battle. Henry was again incarcerated in the Tower of London, where he died in May. Originally, it was believed that Henry died of melancholy, but it was later decided he must have been murdered, although no one knows by whom. Henry's death marked the end of the Lancaster line. On April 9, 1483, Edward IV died at the age of 41, possibly of pneumonia of typhoid. On his deathbed, Edward IV entrusted his loyal brother, Richard, Duke of York, as Lord Protector to the heir, Edward V. Richard didn't hear of the death immediately because Elizabeth Woodville and her family waited to notify him until they knew their place within the reign was secure. When Richard did hear, he rushed to meet Edward V on his return journey. Richard intercepted Edward on April 29th. The following morning, Richard had Earl Rivers and Elizabeth's son, Lord Richard Grey, arrested and sent north to be executed. Upon reaching London, Richard had Edward placed in the Tower of London for his protection. Elizabeth fled to Westminster Abbey with her family and servants. Eventually, Richard would have her imprisoned in the Tower as well. It was not initially suspicious that the princes were sent to the Tower. They were vulnerable and had to be kept safe. The Tower is also the starting point for the coronation process, and it was tradition for monarchs to stay there until the ceremony. Edward's coronation was set for June 22, 1483, and preparations were underway. Slowly, the celebrations that had been planned for Edward's coronation became celebrations for Richard, Duke of Gloucester. In June, Parliament declared the princes illegitimate on the grounds that their father was contracted to marry Lady Eleanor Butler when he married Elizabeth Woodville. That made the marriage between Edward IV and Elizabeth invalid, which made their children illegitimate. That meant Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was next in line for the throne. On July 6, King Richard II was crowned. The princes were never seen alive again. The last reference to the young princes is in the Great Chronicle written by Italian chronicler Dominic Manici. On June 16th, he recorded that the princes were seen shooting arrows and playing in the garden of the tower. He also wrote, "Withdrawn to the inner apartments of the tower proper, and day by day began to be seen more rarely behind the bars and windows until at length they ceased to appear altogether. Already there is a suspicion that they have been done away with." What happened next to the princes has been a subject of debate ever since. The current belief is that the princes were quietly murdered sometime in the autumn of that year. About 30 years passed before the first account of their disappearance was written. In the unfinished biography, The History of Richard III, written by Henry VIII's Chancellor Sir Thomas More between the years 1513 and 1518, Richard III is portrayed as a villain. More wrote that the children were lying in their beds while Miles Forrest and John Dighton came into the chamber around midnight, and that they smothered the boys until they were dead. What happened to the princes? There are several theories. The first and seemingly most likely theory is that Richard III killed them for the throne. He wanted them out of the way, and as his enemies grew, he became increasingly paranoid. He even had a close ally, Lord Hastings, arrested and executed. It's also possible that they were killed by Henry Stafford, 2nd Duke of Buckingham. Stafford was Richard III's right-hand man. It's possible that Stafford took it upon himself to have the princes executed to protect Richard. Eventually, Stafford was executed by Richard III. Henry VII is another suspect. After he took the throne from Richard III in 1485, he had all rival claimants executed. John Howard was a loyal friend of Richard III. He had custody at the time the princes' disappearances. Could he have had them executed? Margaret Beaufort was the mother of future King Henry VII and paternal grandmother to Henry VIII. She would have done anything to ensure her son got the throne. Could she have been responsible for the princes disappearing? It's also possible that no one executed the princes. Some believe that one or both brothers survived their incarceration. One theory is that Edward died in the Tower of poor health while his brother Richard managed to escape. Another theory is that the boys were smuggled out of the tower. On August 22, 1485, Richard III was killed in the Battle of Bosworth Field. His opponent, Henry Tudor, was crowned Henry VII on October 30th. In January of 1486, Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, the prince's oldest sister. Together they ended the War of the Roses. In 1487, an Oxford priest named Richard Simon encouraged a boy named Lambert Simnel to pose as the surviving Prince Richard to claim his birthright. The boy wasn't taken very seriously. Peter Warbeck also pretended to be Prince Richard, and he was taken more seriously. Some powerful figures acknowledged him, including Margaret of York and James IV of Scotland. The fact that the pretenders claimed to be Richard and not Edward, the heir to the throne, was considered proof that Edward had died. In 1674, King Charles II ordered the demolition of what remained of the royal palace to the south of the White Tower, including a private staircase leading to St. John's Chapel. Beneath the staircase, the demolition crew discovered the skeletal remains of two young children, ages similar to the princes. The skeletons were put on display for 4 years until Charles II arranged for their reburial in Westminster Abbey. In 1933, a controversial analysis of the bones was done, and the results were inconclusive. We still don't know who they were for sure. Many believe they were the bones of the princes. In December of 2024, Professor of History at University of Huddersfield, Tim Thornton, uncovered evidence that Richard III was behind the death of the princes. He found mention of a chain belonging to Edward V in the will of the sister-in-law of one of Richard III's servants, James Tyrrell. The will was written 33 years after the disappearances. The entry in the will reads, "I bequeath to my son, Sir Giles, his father's chain, which was young King Edward V's. Richard III was previously named and accused of ordering the murder of the two princes, but this will seems to lend even more credence to the argument. The chain was the royal chain of office, which was irreplaceable and forever linked to its owner. It is also priceless." Sir James's involvement in the deaths was first reported by Sir Thomas More, who claimed he hired 2 men to do the killing. Thornton said that the identification of the chain was important, as powerful men of the time wore them as an expression of their identity. He continued that the chains would have proved to be symbols of who they were. Thornton says there are a lot of ways that Sir James may have gotten his hands on the chain, some being neutral, but it adds to the likelihood that the 2 boys were murdered. What happened to the princes in the tower? Were they murdered, or did they somehow escape? What do you think? Leave a comment and let me know what you think. Thanks for listening to today's episode of That's Ready Mysterious. Join me next week for another captivating mystery.